out there, and welcome to OT Ideas for Littles. Today we're going to talk about sensory bins. Before we get started, make sure you hit the subscribe button, the like button if you enjoy the content, and the notifications if you'd like to receive updates on when new videos are available. So, sensory bins. Sensory bins have become very popular in the last several years as people have started to understand the importance of sensory-rich environments for brain development. So what is a sensory bin? A sensory bin is basically any sort of container that holds any sort of sensory material. This is a pretty broad category and allows for lots and lots of different creative ideas to be used within the bin. Sensory bins are beneficial for all children as it allows them a hands-on opportunity to explore the world through their senses. Sensory bins are also very common and popular in OT practice and are used to target a variety of skills. For example, maybe a child has a hard time with attending to the task, staying calm and regulated, and engaging with other people. We might use a sensory bin if that tactile input helps with those certain abilities. Other children in OT practice have a hard time exploring certain textures, touching certain textures. So we might use the sensory bin to work to rewire the brain to allow them to explore that texture without thinking that it might be harmful or without feeling that it's painful. Sensory bins can be used in lots of other ways as well. They can be used to target fine motor skills, something like scooping. They can be used to target communication or social skills if you have another partner at the sensory bin with a child, cognitive skills, executive functioning. Really, the sensory bin is an open-ended activity that can be used to target a variety of skills. So basically, the sensory bin is a vessel for exploration and learning. So today I want to talk about how to set up a sensory bin at home and some common barriers that I've heard parents talk about. So let's talk about how to set up that sensory bin. Step number one is choosing a bin. Ideally, we want a bin that is large enough for the child to be able to explore the sensory materials, and it's often also beneficial to have a clear bin so that the child can see what's inside. This is one of my favorite size bins. For kids who are younger and want all the sensory input, they're able to sit in the bin. For kids who are older, it allows them to, play with different tools and have enough space to explore. So this is my favorite size for an at-home bin. Today I'm going to use a little bit smaller sensory bin for this example. This is the bin that I used to take into homes when I was traveling into homes before COVID. Easy to throw into my car and just kind of move around. But if you're setting one up at home and you have the ability, I would get the larger bin. If not, the smaller bin is okay. I would be careful going any smaller than this, just because if you give a child a sensory activity in a really small bowl, it's going to be really easy that it goes outside the bowl and ends up on the floor. So this bin is okay, the bigger one's better. If you don't have a plastic bin at home, even something like a cardboard box will work just fine. So step number one, find the bin. Step number two, decide on a filler. So what kind of sensory material are you going to put inside the bin for exploration? So depending on the purpose of your sensory bin, you might choose dry material, you might choose a wet material, you might choose a sticky material. It kind of just depends. Something to think about if your child is still mouthing, choosing a material that is either safe to eat or is much larger and is not going to be a choking hazard are things to think about. So just as an example of a dry material, I have some rice. And for a wet but not sticky material, these are water beads. Definitely choking hazard for younger ones and should not be put in the mouth. So we'll just use the rice today. So once you have your filler, just gonna pour it in. That's enough. You could do a little bit more, but that's okay. So there's lots of different types of filler. There's dry materials like rice, beans, lentils, cornmeal. Some wet materials might be water, water beads, maybe jello or cooked noodles, shaving cream, bubble foam. There's lots and lots of ideas out there on the internet. A simple Pinterest search or Google search will give you a million different sensory bin activities. Lots of people love to make them based on the season or just have really cute ideas for different sensory bins. So look there if you're looking for more ideas. So step 2 was the filler, and step 3 is adding objects. So again, depending on the skill that you're targeting with the sensory bin, you're going to choose objects appropriately. They can be as simple as something like a bowl, a spoon, maybe a little tea container. If you're working on scooping, maybe working on twisting, shaking. The objects can be pretty simple. Maybe you want to put some tongs in there, maybe some cookie cutters, maybe an egg shaker, maybe small figurines or cars. Depending on what you're going for, that's where you get to be creative. So step 3, adding objects. There you have it. There's your sensory bin, ready for exploration. So oftentimes when I bring a sensory bin into a family's home, it's the first time that they've seen one of these. Oftentimes I get pushed back, or families aren't really sure how to navigate the sensory bin. So I want to go over some barriers today. Number 1 barrier that I hear parents talk about is the sensory bin is messy and it's just too much work to clean up. So I'd rather not even do it. I think if we think about setting expectations and doing a little bit of planning ahead of time to set up the space, we can make the sensory bin activity much more successful. So what am I talking about by expectations? Every time that I bring a sensory bin into a child's home, there's one rule. The material stays in the bin. We talk about it ahead of time, we go over it, they know if the material goes out of the bin, then we're gonna have to be all done and clean up. By creating firm, clear, and consistent boundaries or expectations, kids are able to know what's expected and, for the most part, follow those rules. Okay? If a child at one point takes a big handful of the sensory material, puts it on the floor, I'm going to give them one warning. I'm going to tell them again, the material stays in the bin. If it goes out, we're going to be all done. It stays in the bin. If they do it again, I'm going to clean up the material, put the lid on, put the bin away. Usually it takes 1 or 2 times, depending on how old they are, it might take more, of them having the bin taken away, that consequence that they learn, okay, I got to keep it in the bin. The other thing that helps when thinking about this activity being really messy is setting up the space ahead of time, just in case, some of it's going to spill out while they're playing, while they're having fun without them purposefully doing it. So oftentimes when I bring a bin into a home, I will bring also a towel or a blanket. So I'll just lay out that blanket underneath the bin to create a second boundary, and then also if a little bit of the rice spills over during play, at the end I can just bundle up this blanket, take the rice over to the trash can, empty it out, and my cleanup is a lot easier. Other ideas might be to do sensory play if it's more wet sensory play, either in the bathtub or outside. Thinking about what time of day do you as a family have extra time to, 1, clean up the space, and 2, clean up the child if they're dirty. Not so much with the dry bins, but the wet bins. Let's say, for example, you're playing with shaving cream and the child, it potentially could be covered in shaving cream. Maybe doing that activity right before bath time would make it less stressful for your family. So thinking about the location, thinking about the time of day, as well as those expectations can help ease that mess and the stress that goes along with it. Another common barrier that I hear from families is that the caregiver, the parent, has similar sensory preferences or aversions as the child. So let's say the child doesn't like to get their hands dirty, so we're kind of exploring more of a wet bin, and the parent or the caregiver is having a really hard time with that because they feel the same way. They don't want to touch it, they don't want to explore it. What do we do? One idea might be to see if anybody else in the family is able to model, maybe a sibling or a friend or a caregiver or the therapist, if they're there, can model that exploration. Another idea might be to show the kid that it's okay, work through it together. This is really hard for mommy, but I'm gonna poke it, and then I'm gonna wipe my hands, and that's okay. You can wipe your hands when they get dirty, that's okay. The last barrier that I hear from families is just them not understanding why the sensory bin is important. So if you're creating sensory bins for your child just to have a sensory rich environment, that's fantastic. This one is more for families who are working with a therapist and they aren't quite sure what's the purpose of this goal. It's not as clear, right? It's just some rice and a spoon and a cup and a bin, and I don't really know why we're doing this. My advice would just be ask your therapist. Your therapist should be able to clarify the goals of why they're using the sensory bin and the benefits of the sensory bin. So if you're not clear on why it's being used, please, please, please ask your therapist. So that's all for today. I've talked about how to set up a sensory bin and some common barriers. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, hit the notification button if you want updates on when videos are created, and thanks for listening. The importance of sensory-rich development. And oftentimes their first reaction is, whoa, that's going to be so messy.